After Hours, Chapter 1. It was well past 8 p.m., and most of the office was empty, save for the hum of computers and the occasional sound of typing. Juno sat at his desk, surrounded by several screens filled with lines of code. He rubbed his eyes, the fatigue of a long day settling in. The deadline for the new feature was looming, and though he had already worked through most of the bugs, there was still the issue of finalizing the integration. He couldn't afford to leave it unfinished. A soft click echoed from across the room. He turned his head to see Venetia Vaughn, the CTO, entering the office with her sleek black blazer and hair still perfectly in place despite the late hour. She didn't seem surprised to find Juno still working.
"You're still here?" Venetia's voice was calm but laced with curiosity as she made her way to her office.
Juno was mildly surprised to see her. Most of the senior staff had left hours ago, and he'd grown accustomed to having the office almost entirely to himself. He sat up a little straighter, his hands still at the keyboard. "Yeah, just finishing up the integration for the new feature," he replied, his voice soft and a bit shy. He'd seen Venetia around the office before, of course, but he'd never actually spoken to her. He always felt somewhat intimidated in her presence, though he couldn't quite put his finger on why.
Venetia paused near his desk, glancing over his shoulder at the code on his screen. Her sharp eyes took in the lines of text, the carefully organized work. "You've been at this for hours, haven't you?" Venetia asked, tilting her head slightly. She didn't wait for an answer, instead pulling up a chair and sitting down next to him. "You've made a lot of progress, but it looks like you're hitting a wall on this last part."
Juno was taken aback by Venetia's casual approach. She was so close now, so close he could smell her perfume, a mix of roses and something subtle, something earthy. He tried to focus on the code on the screen, but her presence was distracting. "Yeah, I've been trying different approaches, but none of them seem right," he admitted, his eyes flicking to her for a moment before returning to the code. He was unused to company while working, especially from someone so close and influential.
Venetia watched him for a moment, considering her next words. "I can help you figure it out. It's the last piece of the puzzle, right?"
Juno was slightly taken aback that the CTO herself was offering to help him with a problem as mundane as this. He nodded slowly, a mixture of surprise and excitement at the idea. Yeah, the last piece," he confirmed, his voice a little shaky from the close proximity and the realization that he was in the presence of one of the company's most important people. "I'm just stuck on how to handle the integration without slowing down the system."
Venetia leaned over slightly, her presence close but professional. "Sometimes, getting a fresh perspective helps. We've all been there." Venetia nodded slowly, absorbing the problem. "It sounds like an issue with how the data's being processed. You're looking at it from a back-end perspective, but maybe we need to tweak the front end to accommodate it." She clicked through his code, pointing out a couple of lines he might have overlooked. "Try this and let's see if it works."
Juno felt a strange mixture of awe and something else as he watched Venetia's slender, elegant fingers moving across the screen, pointing out parts of the code he hadn't noticed before. Her knowledge was impressive, her approach so precise. He quickly made the changes she suggested, his heart rate subtly accelerating as he did. "Okay, let's see," he muttered under his breath and hit the enter key. The code began to run, and a moment of tension filled the air as they waited for the results. As the code ran, Juno leaned in slightly, his eyes fixed on the screen. The tension was palpable, the silence in the office broken only by the soft whir of the computer. He stole a glance at Venetia, her profile calm and focused, her attention completely on the task at hand. After a few moments, the computer's whirring slowed, and the results appeared. Juno's eyes went wide, and then a small sigh of relief escaped his lips. It worked," he said, his voice soft and slightly shaken.
Venetia smiled, but it wasn't a smile of triumph. It was more like a knowing look. "Great," she said simply, standing up from her chair. "I know you've been working hard on this, but sometimes stepping back and letting someone else look at it can help to see things more clearly." Her eyes met his for a brief moment, something more personal than professional.
Juno stared up at her, a mix of relief and something else coursing through him. He was still struggling to believe the CTO herself had helped him solve the issue. "Thank you," he managed to say after a moment, his voice softer than usual. The realization that he was suddenly so close to her, looking up at her from his chair, made his heart flutter in his chest. He stood up, not wanting to look too small, and rubbed the back of his neck awkwardly.
Venetia locked eyes with him and offered a small smile. "You're welcome. Good work, Juno. Get some rest. We've got a lot more to do tomorrow," she said before turning and heading into her office.
Juno sat for a few moments in silence, his mind reeling from the interaction. Venetia's quiet praise lingered in his mind, and her expression, that strange mix of professional advice and something more personal, was harder to forget. As her office door closed, he let out a deep breath, his heart still racing. He'd always looked up to people in positions of power like Venetia, admired their skills and respected their authority. But now, there was something else, a small inkling of a feeling he couldn't quite name. The silence in the office felt heavy now, as if the space around him had shifted after her departure. He felt strangely deflated, as if he'd been holding his breath, and now the air had gone out of him all at once. He packed up his things, his thoughts running over the problem he'd just solved and the strange way Venetia's presence had affected him. He tried to ignore the small, unfamiliar flutter in his chest, but it was still there, like a secret waiting to be unraveled. As he walked out of the office and into the crisp night air, he decided he needed a drink. Juno rarely drank alcohol. It wasn't usually his thing, but tonight he needed something, anything, to push away the thoughts that were swirling in his mind. The images of Venetia's confident, composed demeanor mixed with the way she'd looked at him, the small, intimate smile, it was hard to ignore. He stepped into a bar and ordered a beer. Then he found a seat in a dark corner booth. He took a long, steady drink. The beer went down easily, and the bitter taste lingered on his tongue as his head was filled with a warm, almost soothing buzz. He took another drink. The alcohol was working its magic, blurring the edges of his thoughts and dulling the confusing mix of feelings he had experienced earlier. But then, a small voice in the back of his mind spoke up, no matter how much he tried to ignore it. "Why did she help you?" The question echoed like a lonely, unwelcome guest. Juno pushed it away and took another swig of beer. "Why did she look at you like that? Like she saw you, really saw you?" It was a foreign feeling, the thought of Venetia seeing him, truly seeing him as more than just another colleague. He'd always been the kind of person to avoid the limelight, to disappear into the background. It was easier that way, safer. But something in Venetia's quiet command, in the way she'd looked at him, made him feel seen in a way he hadn't before. He ran his fingers through his dark hair, the beer making his head swim slightly. The bar around him was now mostly empty. The late hour, sending the other patrons home. He downed the last of his beer and signaled the bartender for another. The feeling of vulnerability that had been pushed back by the first two drinks was creeping back in, and it was bringing questions with it. Why had she given him that look? Why had she cared enough to help him with that problem? A problem that, in the grand scheme of things, was insignificant. The questions echoed in his head like a chorus of whispered secrets. He took a sip of the new drink, the bitterness not as sharp this time. He tried to distract himself, to focus on something else, anything else, but his mind kept circling back to Venetia. The memory of her eyes, the sound of her voice, the way she'd looked at him, he couldn't shake it. He took another drink, the edges of his vision growing fuzzy. He couldn't remember the last time he'd felt this way, this out of control, this aware of someone, of the curve of their lips, the depth of their gaze, the intensity of their presence. And then another question emerged, unbidden, floating to the surface through the haze of alcohol and confusion. Was he attracted to her? The thought sent a shiver through him, a thrill that was both exhilarating and terrifying. He'd never considered it before, but now, in the quiet, lonely atmosphere of the bar, it was undeniable. The feeling was there, buzzing like electricity under his skin, making his heart pound against his ribs. He took another big swig of the beer, savoring the taste. He couldn't lie to himself anymore. The alcohol had stripped away the last of his inhibitions, revealing a truth he'd been refusing to acknowledge. He was attracted to Venetia Vaughn, his boss, his mentor, and 15 years older than him. The thought was both exciting and deeply unsettling. It didn't make any sense. This burning desire, this inexplicable pull toward her. He took another drink, the alcohol making it easier to face the reality of his situation. He was attracted to her, attracted to the confidence, the power, the air that she carried herself with like it was a second nature. But he was also scared. Scared of the implications, scared of the power imbalance, scared of the risk of getting his heart broken. He was too reserved, too shy, too boring. Venetia was a force of nature, and he was a shy wallflower. The sun filtered through the office windows, casting a harsh, unwelcome light on Juno. He squinted, his head throbbing from the excesses of the previous night. He'd had one too many drinks, more than he was used to handling, and now he was paying the price. He leaned back in his chair, massaging his temples, trying to will away the headache. The memories of the previous night were hazy, but one thing was clear. He had developed a strange, impossible crush on Venetia Vaughn. He tried to focus on his work, to distract himself from the pounding in his head and the strange, unsettling feeling in his stomach. But every time the door to Venetia's office opened, he felt a jolt of nerves, a mixture of excitement and trepidation. He tried to keep his eyes on his screen, to act normal, but a part of him couldn't help but look discreetly towards her office, hoping for a glimpse of her. He felt like a teenager with a crush, and the feeling was unfamiliar and unsettling. The hours passed slowly, each ticking sound of the clock like a hammer to his skull. He managed to get some work done, but his focus was scattered, his thoughts constantly drifting. As lunchtime approached, he felt a sense of dread. He usually ate alone. The idea of socializing with colleagues was too daunting, but today he dreaded the loneliness, the silence that would leave him too much time to think. The soft hum of the office air conditioning blended with the faint whir of the microwave as Juno stood by the counter, fumbling with the lid of his homemade bento box. He was carefully avoiding eye contact with anyone who might wander into the kitchen. The quiet was a solace, until the sound of heels clicking against the tile floor sent his heart into an anxious flutter.
Venetia entered, her presence commanding even in the casual setting of the office kitchen. A loose strand of her dark brown hair fell out of place as she placed her coffee mug on the counter. "Afternoon, Juno," Venetia said casually, her soft voice breaking the silence.
Juno tensed at the sound of her voice. He turned, trying to act nonchalant, but his heart was hammering in his chest. Venetia was standing by the counter, as poised and composed as ever. Her loose strand of hair and casual manner didn't seem to change anything about the way she carried herself. She was still the powerful, confident woman he'd grown to admire and desire. "Good afternoon," he managed to croak out, his voice sounding strained and unnatural to his own ears.
Venetia smiled lightly as she poured coffee into her mug, the rich aroma filling the room. "Did you sleep okay? Sorry to point this out, but your eye bags." She gestured toward her own under-eye area to clarify what she had meant.
Juno felt his cheeks flush with embarrassment. He hadn't been able to sleep last night, and it was evident in the dark circles under his eyes. He had hoped no one would notice, but of course, Venetia had. "Oh, yeah," he replied, rubbing the back of his neck awkwardly. "I didn't sleep well. Too much coffee yesterday, I guess." He was lying, of course, but he couldn't exactly tell her the real reason. That thinking, obsessing about her had kept him up all night.
Venetia leaned casually against the counter, watching him as he meticulously arranged his food, his long fingers almost trembling as he adjusted a piece of rolled egg. She tilted her head slightly, curiosity sparking in her eyes. "Did you make that yourself?" she asked, breaking the silence.
Juno was acutely aware of her gaze on him as he fiddled with his bento box. His usually steady hands were a bit shaky, his heart still racing from her unexpected appearance. Her question caught him off guard, and he looked up, meeting her gaze for a brief moment before looking back down at his food. Yeah," he admitted, his voice a bit quieter than usual. "I like to cook, in my free time. It's therapeutic, I guess." He avoided her eyes, feeling vulnerable under her gaze.
"Impressive," Venetia said with an approving nod. "I can barely manage to boil water on a good day."
Despite his nervousness, Juno managed a small, proud smile. "Thanks. I learned from my dad," he said, the memories of standing on a stool next to his father in their small kitchen bringing some comfort. "He's the real cook in the family. Used to make everything from scratch. Always said it helps you understand the food better. I guess I picked up a few things from him."
Venetia's smile softened as she studied him. "Sounds like a great way to bond."
Juno nodded, a fond smile on his face. "Yeah," he said. "It was more than just bonding, though. Learning to cook from my dad, it taught me about patience, about taking time to get things right. He's always been all about details, perfection, you know?" He paused, his heart fluttering as he realized he was talking too much, saying too much. He forced himself to stop, to look back down at his lunch.
"Well, it shows," Venetia said with a small smile, reaching for a packet of sugar to stir into her coffee. "I can see those qualities reflected in the way you approach your work, and it's something that deserves far more recognition and praise than it gets."
Juno's heart skipped a beat at her words. Her praise was both unexpected and appreciated, but it also made his pulse race. He couldn't tell if it was just her professional assessment or if there was something more personal in her compliment. Either way, it left him feeling flustered and a bit guilty for the direction his thoughts had taken over the last 24 hours. "Thank you," he managed to say, the word catching in his throat. He ducked his head slightly, trying to hide the flush that he could feel spreading across his cheeks.
Venetia let the moment linger, enjoying the subtle tension. Juno's shy, awkward demeanor was a stark contrast to the confident and self-assured men she usually interacted with. There was something refreshingly genuine about him, a quiet authenticity that intrigued her. "Well, don't let me keep you from your lunch," Venetia said finally, her tone light but with a trace of warmth. "But if you ever feel like sharing some of your cooking, let me know. I could use the help."
Juno's heart fluttered at her words, surprise and excitement warring inside him. Was she hinting that she wanted to taste his cooking? The thought was exciting and terrifying. Spending more time with Venetia would be both heaven and hell, especially with the strange, inexplicable feelings he was already struggling to control. Yeah, he managed to say, trying to keep his voice even. "Sure, maybe sometime. I'll keep that in mind."
Venetia chuckled softly, grabbing her coffee and giving him one last look. "Have a good lunch, Juno." With that, she left the kitchen, her footsteps fading into the distance.
Juno watched her go, his heart still racing. The encounter had been confusing. On the one hand, her words and gaze had sent his heart fluttering. On the other, they'd made him feel strangely guilty, as if he were crossing a line in his mind that he should not be crossing. As the sound of her footsteps faded, he sighed heavily and sat down at the table, his thoughts awhirl. What was he doing, having these sort of feelings for his boss? And a woman 15 years his senior nonetheless.
Meanwhile, Venetia returned to her office with a faint smile on her lips, her curiosity about Juno sparking in a way she hadn't anticipated.
The rest of the day passed in a haze for Juno. Whenever his thoughts returned to the office kitchen, to Venetia's soft voice and intense gaze, his heart would race and he would lose his focus on his tasks. By the end of the day, he was drained and mentally exhausted. The memory of Venetia's words, her offer to taste his cooking, kept echoing in his mind, giving him a strange sense of hope and trepidation.
As night fell over the office, Venetia and Juno were the only ones remaining, putting in overtime. The office was quiet except for the faint hum of computers and the occasional clicking of keyboards. "Juno," Venetia's voice broke through his thoughts, calm yet commanding. She stood beside his desk, holding a tablet with the failed test results displayed. "I noticed the error in the algorithm. Let's go over it."
Juno's heart skipped a beat when he heard Venetia's voice. He quickly closed the app he'd been multitasking in and turned to face her, nodding quickly. "Yes, of course," he said, his voice a bit more nervous than he would have liked. He scooted his chair closer to her, his heart racing as she stood close, the scent of her perfume filling his senses.
She pulled up a chair and sat next to him, her focus entirely on the screen. Pointing at a specific line of code, Venetia explained, "Here's where it went wrong. You're overcomplicating the logic. Try simplifying it like this." She walked him through the correction with a precision that left Juno both intimidated and awestruck.
Juno listened intently, his earlier stress fading as he focused on her words. Venetia was a master of her craft, and her explanations were both clear and concise. He felt a surge of admiration and respect for her as he watched her point out the mistake and guide him in fixing it. Despite the professional nature of the situation, he couldn't help but notice how close she was to him, the warmth radiating off her body, the smell of her perfume. It was simultaneously distracting and tantalizing.
"Do you understand now?" Her eyes shifted from the screen to his, the quietness and tension rising between them. She hadn't noticed before how green his hazel eyes were or how long his lashes seemed.
Juno looked up at her, their proximity suddenly more prominent. He swallowed, his heart fluttering in his chest. "Yeah," he said, his voice cracking slightly. He cursed inwardly at his lack of composure, the way his body was reacting to her presence. He averted his eyes, trying to focus on the screen, but he was aware of her gaze on him, the air suddenly thick with tension. Your correction makes sense," he managed to say, his hand trembling slightly on the keyboard.
She diverted her gaze and tried to regain some semblance of composure and professionalism. Her tone remained calm but carried an edge, as if challenging him to rise to her expectations. "You're capable of more, Juno. Don't doubt yourself."
Juno's heart skipped a beat at her words. Coming from her, "you're capable of more," was high praise. And yet, part of him couldn't help but wonder if she was speaking about more than just his work. The intensity, the confidence in her eyes, in her words, sent a shiver down his spine. "I'll do my best," he managed to say. The truth was, he knew he was more than capable. The real problem was his own self-doubt, his lack of confidence.
Venetia stood up with a smile and gently patted his shoulder to reassure him. "It's late. Finish it up tomorrow. I'm heading out now." Her hand slipped off his shoulder as she walked toward her office to gather her things.
The simple touch of her hand on his shoulder sent a jolt through Juno, his heart skipping another painful beat. He watched her walk back to her office, his gaze following her every move, his mind spinning. He wanted to say something, to keep her there with him for just a few minutes more, but the words stuck in his throat and he remained silent, watching her disappear into her office. As the door closed behind her, Juno let out a shaky breath, his hands trembling slightly. "Get a grip on yourself," he scolded himself silently. A few days later, Juno was deep in concentration when an email notification appeared on his screen. Subject: High Priority Project Assignment. He opened it to find Venetia's name at the bottom of the email. Juno's heart leapt into his throat as he read the email. He'd been given a high-priority project, and Venetia herself had assigned it to him. The project sounded challenging and important, a chance to showcase his skills. But the realization that he'd be working closely with Venetia sent anxiety coursing through him. It was both an exciting opportunity and a tantalizing threat. He'd be spending more time with her. In a professional capacity, of course. But the thought still made his stomach flutter with both anticipation and apprehension.
That afternoon, Venetia approached his desk, her presence as commanding as ever. "Juno, you got my email? I'll be overseeing this project directly. Let's meet in the conference room to go over the initial framework."
Juno looked up, his heart skipping a beat as Venetia appeared at his desk. The sight of her so close, her authoritative yet elegant presence, never failed to make his heart race. Yeah, he said, trying to sound composed, but he could tell his voice was a bit shaky. "The email. Yes, I got it." The idea of working closely with her on this project was both exhilarating and intimidating, but he nodded, gathering his things to head to the conference room.
The conference room felt larger than usual as Venetia outlined the project's objectives, her confidence filling the space. "You'll handle the detailed coding," she said, sliding a folder across the table. "I'll provide high-level guidance and check in regularly. Any questions?"
Juno sat across from her, listening intently to her instructions, the sound of her voice captivating him despite his efforts to focus on her words. When she asked if he had questions, he mentally shook himself, forcing himself to concentrate. No questions," he managed to say, though his mind was still struggling to process the fact that he'd be handling the coding while she, his boss and the object of his not-so-secret desires, would be overseeing everything. As they began working on the project and days turned into weeks, Juno found himself both inspired and unnerved by Venetia's sharp mind and attention to detail. She would occasionally lean over his screen, reviewing his progress and offering suggestions. Her proximity made his pulse quicken, though he tried to focus on her words instead of the faint scent of her perfume.
"You're doing well," Venetia said during one of her check-ins, her tone softer than usual. "Keep it up, Juno. I'm glad I wasn't wrong about choosing you."
The words sent a shiver of pleasure down his spine. It was rare for Venetia to hand out compliments, so for her to say he was doing well made his heart skip a beat. He glanced up at her, meeting her eyes. Her gaze was intense, but gentle, filled with a mixture of respect and something else he couldn't quite put his finger on. It made it hard for him to focus on the task at hand. Thanks," he managed to stammer, his cheeks reddening slightly. I'm trying my best."
Venetia began to notice Juno's quiet dedication and the meticulous care he poured into his work. Though he struggled to express himself, his talent and determination spoke volumes.
Each interaction between them slowly carried an undercurrent of tension, a subtle but growing awareness of one another beyond the professional dynamic. For Juno, her intelligence and commanding presence only fueled his admiration.
While for Venetia, she found herself increasingly intrigued by the shy yet capable developer who worked tirelessly behind the scenes.
As the weeks passed, Juno became more and more in awe of Venetia. Her confidence, her intellect, her ability to command respect, it was all mesmerizing to him. Yet, he could also see glimpses of a different side to her. She was kind and patient, guiding him with gentle yet firm direction, and her praise fueled his determination to do his absolute best work. But it was the tension that arose between them, subtle yet undeniable, that sent his mind into constant turmoil. He was her subordinate, yet he found himself desiring her more and more with each passing day.
The soft hum of conversation filled the conference room as the team wrapped up their weekly meeting. Venetia stood at the head of the table, her presence effortlessly commanding as she gave final instructions for the next phase of the project. Juno sat near the middle, taking meticulous notes and avoiding eye contact with anyone, especially her. "Juno, can you stay back for a moment? I want to review some of the code adjustments with you," Venetia said as the rest of the team began to file out.
Juno's heart skipped a beat as he heard his name. The rest of the team had already left, and the soft hum of conversation had faded into silence. It was just him and Venetia now, alone in the conference room. The request seemed innocent enough, but his mind immediately went into overdrive. What did she want to discuss? Was there an issue with his code, or did she want to talk about something else? The thought of being alone with her, with no one around to break the tension, sent a shiver down his spine. Of course, he finally managed to get out.
Venetia walked over to the table, sliding a printed report toward him. "Here's the updated framework. I want to make sure we're aligned on this section." Juno reached for the report at the same time she did, their hands brushing against each other. The contact was brief, a warm, fleeting touch.
The brief touch of her hand set his skin on fire, his heart fluttering erratically in his chest. He withdrew his hand swiftly, almost as if he had touched something forbidden. His cheeks burned a deep red, and he looked anywhere but her. "Sorry," he managed to stammer, avoiding her gaze. He tried to focus on the report, but his mind was in turmoil. The proximity, the scent of her perfume, her hand brushing his... it was all too much.
Venetia paused, her fingers still resting lightly on the paper. Her composure remained intact, but a subtle change in her expression hinted at something more. The moment was brief, but the touch lingered, leaving a trace of warmth. "It's fine," she said, her voice calm but quieter than usual. Her dark gray eyes flicked up to meet his, and there was an unspoken tension in the air, a current neither of them could ignore.
Juno's heart was racing, his mind a jumble of conflicting emotions. He could feel her gaze on him, her eyes meeting his with an intensity that took his breath away. He tried to form a coherent thought, but his words froze in his throat. His eyes moved to her fingers on the paper, the memory of their touch sending a shiver down his spine. "It's fine," she had said, but her quiet tone betrayed a hint of something else, something beneath the surface that he couldn't quite put into words. He dared to look up at her, their gazes locking.
Venetia cleared her throat, breaking the silence. "Let's focus on this for now," she said, regaining her composure. She leaned slightly closer to point out a specific section, her tone steady and professional, but she couldn't entirely shake the moment.
Juno struggled to regain his composure as well, but her proximity made it impossible. The scent of her perfume filled his nostrils, and he could feel the warmth of her presence in the air. He tried to focus on the report, but the words seemed to swim before his eyes as her voice filled his ears. He nodded, trying to seem detached and composed, but his fingers trembled slightly as he pointed to the section she was referring to. As the meeting wrapped up, Juno packed his things hurriedly, still flustered. "Thank you, Miss Vaughn," he said, his voice barely above a whisper as he stood to leave.
Venetia watched him go, her expression unreadable. Once he was out of sight, she let out a soft exhale, her fingers lightly brushing the spot where their hands had touched. The moment replayed in her mind, unexpected and uncharacteristically distracting.
Juno practically sprinted out of the conference room, his heart still pounding in his chest. As soon as he was out of sight, he leaned against the wall, trying to calm his racing thoughts. His mind was a whirlwind of feelings, confusion, embarrassment, and a growing sense of desire that he was desperately trying to suppress. He couldn't help but replay the moment their hands had touched, the softness of her skin, the brief jolt it had sent through him, the way she hadn't immediately pulled away. All of it kept repeating in his mind like a broken record.
The rest of the day, Venetia found herself stealing subtle glances at him, intrigued by his reaction and the unexpected flutter of emotion the moment had stirred within her. Despite her best efforts to maintain her focus, the memory lingered, sparking a curiosity she hadn't felt in years.
Juno felt Venetia's eyes on him throughout the day, her gaze lingering on him for just a fraction of a second longer than necessary. His skin tingled with each glance, and he could feel his heart rate quicken every time he felt her gaze. He tried to focus on his work, but his thoughts kept returning to the conference room, to the moment their hands had touched. The memory played on repeat in his mind, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between them, though he didn't know what.
Once again, the only individuals left in the office were Venetia and Juno. The clock on the wall read 8:27 p.m., and the usual bustling energy of the day had faded into a hushed stillness. The sound of Venetia's door opening startled Juno. She stepped out, looking slightly more casual than her usual composed self. Her blazer was draped over one arm and she was smoothing out her blouse. "Juno," she called, her voice cutting through the quiet.
Juno's head jerked up at the sound of his name, his heart skipping a beat as he watched her stride out of her office. The sight of her looking slightly more relaxed and casual, her blazer draped over her arm, made his breath catch in his throat. "Yeah?" he managed to get out, his voice slightly hoarse. He tried desperately to act normal, as if his heart wasn't pounding erratically in his chest, as if her sudden presence hadn't thrown him off balance.
Venetia gave him a small smile. "It's getting late. You've been at it for hours. Do you want to grab dinner? My treat."
Juno's heart leapt at the unexpected offer. Her treat? The thought echoed in his head but was quickly overshadowed by a wave of embarrassment. He had been looking forward to the moment he could offer her the food he had prepared. But her proposal made things more complicated. He stammered, trying to find a polite way to decline. I actually packed a meal for myself."
She watched as he reached under his desk and pulled out a neatly packed container. Venetia raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "You cooked?"
Yeah," Juno said, his cheeks turning a slight shade of pink. He set the container on the desk, and as he began to unwrap it, he avoided her gaze, suddenly feeling self-conscious. "It's nothing fancy, really. Just some beef and rice."
The corners of Venetia's lips lifted into an amused smile as she stepped closer to his desk. "Really? You made this with me in mind?"
Juno's heart skipped a beat as she neared, her gentle tone both reassuring and flustering. He swallowed hard, trying to maintain his composure. Yeah, I thought you might like to try it," he mumbled, his voice slightly shaky. He finally looked up at her, his hands still fidgeting as he took the lid off the container. "It's not much, though. It's just something simple that I cooked at home."
"Juno," Venetia said, her tone softer than usual. "I'm honored. Let's see what you've got." They settled at his desk. Juno opened the first container, meant for her, to reveal a beautifully arranged meal. Tender beef smothered in rich, savory brown gravy, served over a small mound of steamed rice, the whole dish finished with a scattering of fresh green onion for a pop of color and brightness. Venetia's eyes widened slightly as she picked up a fork. "This looks amazing," she said, taking her first bite. Her expression shifted almost imperceptibly as she chewed. "This is really good."
Juno watched her carefully, anxious for her reaction as she took her first bite. His heart leaped as he saw her expression morph from surprise to appreciation. "Really?" he asked, a soft smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. You like it?" The fact that she appreciated his cooking filled him with a warm sense of satisfaction, making the butterflies in his stomach flutter even more erratically.
"Yes, really." She took another bite, savoring the flavors. "You weren't kidding about cooking being your thing."
Juno's cheeks tingled with a mix of shyness and pride. Her genuine compliment made his heart swell, and he fidgeted with his fingers, trying to remain casual. "Thanks," he replied, a hint of a smile on his lips. "I'm glad you like it." As she continued to eat, a comfortable silence settled over them, and Juno couldn't help but steal glances at her, admiring the way her features softened as she savored his cooking. As they sat and ate, Juno felt a little more at ease, the anxiety in his chest slightly dissipated. He watched as Venetia took another bite, her expression indicating her appreciation, making him smile again. "You know, my little sister Emmy is my biggest fan when it comes to my cooking," he said with a soft chuckle. "Whenever I make something, she's always the first one to ask for a bite."
Venetia chuckled softly. "Emmy? She sounds sweet."
Juno's heart jumped a little at the sound of her laughter. Her chuckle was soft, unguarded, and it made the butterflies in his stomach flap wilder than ever. He nodded with a small smile. "Yeah, she's the sweetest." He took a bite of his own food, then added, "When she was a little kid, she was always following me around, wanting to help in the kitchen. She was the taste tester, the sous chef, the cleanup crew, all rolled into one."
Venetia smiled, resting her chin on her hand as she listened. "You're close with her, aren't you?"
Juno nodded subtly, his expression softening at the thought of his little sister. "Yeah, we've always been close," he replied, a hint of fondness in his voice. "I was basically like a second parent when she was growing up, changing her diapers, feeding her, playing with her when our real parents were busy. It was like I was her older brother and a dad, all rolled into one."
Venetia's expression shifted, her usual composed demeanor giving way to something warmer. "That's really responsible of you. I didn't have siblings growing up, just me and my parents."
Juno noted the change in her demeanor, the hint of vulnerability she rarely showed. His heart softened at her confession. "Oh, really?" he said quietly, his voice gentle. "It must have been different growing up as an only child. I can't imagine not having siblings."
Venetia hesitated, her fork hovering over the container. "I mean, I was the apple of their eye, but there was a lot of pressure. My parents expected me to be perfect at everything I did. Straight A, awards, leadership positions, you name it. They meant well, but sometimes it felt like I couldn't just be."
Juno's heart twisted a little at her words, the pain in her voice tugging at his heartstrings. His eyes softened, his gaze steady on her. "That sounds really tough," he replied quietly. "To have all that pressure on you. I know what it's like, having to live up to expectations, trying to be perfect."
"You too?" Venetia asked, her gaze distant for a moment but genuinely curious.
Juno gave a tiny, wry smile, the memories of his own struggles resurfacing. He shifted in his seat, running a hand through his hair. "Yeah, you could say that," he said quietly. "Having an older brother who's the golden child, it's hard to measure up. My parents, they always held him up as the perfect example for me to follow. It's like I've been chasing his shadow my whole life."
She nodded slightly and gave him a small smile, acknowledging and listening intently.
Juno's shoulders relaxed a little as he continued, the words flowing more freely. "It's like, no matter what I do, I can never quite measure up to him. It's made me, I don't know, strive for perfection, I guess. I've always been a bit of a control freak, trying to be the best in everything. But sometimes, I feel like I'm drowning, trying to keep up with expectations that I can't quite reach."
Venetia's heart tightened at his words. She felt truly seen and understood by him. It surprised her to learn that they both struggled with perfectionism. She gazed at him, her expression softening even more. "You're more insightful than you let on, Juno."
Juno's breath hitched slightly at her words, a rush of warmth flooding through him as he met her gaze. No one had ever said something like that to him. Her understanding and validation were unexpected and deeply comforting. The corners of his lips tugged into a small smile. "Thanks," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. I guess I just don't always express myself well. But with you, I feel like I can."
They fell into a comfortable silence for a moment, both lost in their thoughts. Venetia absorbed his words, trying not to take them too much to heart, as they would only confuse her further. She didn't entirely understand why she was so drawn to Juno or why she was willing to let herself be vulnerable around him. She always seemed to let her professionalism slip away in his presence, something she never did with others. "You know," Venetia said at last, her tone lighter, "if this whole programming thing doesn't work out, you could definitely open a restaurant." She chuckled softly, attempting to steer the conversation to something less heavy, avoiding the intimacy that had begun to settle between them.
Juno couldn't help but chuckle along, grateful for the change in topic. He chuckled and shook his head, his expression lighthearted. "Thanks," he replied with a smile. "I'll keep that in mind if I ever need a backup plan, but I think I prefer software development." He took another small bite of food, watching her as she spoke, the tension in his shoulders easing a little. The casual banter between them was comfortable, but the words he'd spoken, the vulnerability he'd let slip, it all still had his heart racing a little faster. As the conversation continued, soft smiles and easy laughter filling the air, Juno became more and more at ease with her. His usually guarded demeanor was slowly crumbling, allowing her glimpses into his softer, more vulnerable side. He talked about Emmy, his voice carrying a sense of pride and devotion. He told her of the times he'd stayed up late helping his sister with homework, the countless meals he'd cooked for her, the way he'd spent hours teaching her to ride a bike. His gaze would often meet hers, stealing glances, before quickly looking away, his heart beating a little faster.
As they finished the meal, Venetia found herself studying Juno more closely. The way his face lit up when he talked about his sister, the nervous energy that seemed to fade when he focused on something he cared about. As they cleaned up and returned to their work, both of them carried the warmth of the conversation with them, each feeling a little more connected than before.
The evening settled into a comfortable rhythm as they returned to work, the hum of computers and soft tapping of keyboards filling the office. Juno found himself glancing at Venetia every now and then as she worked, a small smile on his face. The conversation they'd had, the connection they'd made, was fresh on his mind, the feelings it stirred mixing with the quiet excitement of their shared solitude in the office. The night had a strange, almost intimate atmosphere, making his chest flutter with warmth.
It was nearing midnight, Venetia reviewing reports at her desk, her usual sharp focus starting to blur from exhaustion, when her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and frowned. It was a notification from the system monitoring software. Venetia was out of her chair and moving to the main server room in seconds. When she arrived, Juno was already there, his fingers flying over the keyboard, screens flashing lines of code and error messages. "What happened?" Venetia asked, stepping in beside him, her voice calm but firm.
Juno's attention was completely absorbed in the lines of code, his focus intense. He barely registered Venetia entering the room until she spoke, her voice breaking through his concentration. "I'm not sure yet," he responded quickly, his eyes still glued to the screen. "I was just checking out the servers when I noticed this error message. It's reporting a system overload, but—" He trailed off, his fingers typing rapidly as he navigated through various windows.
Venetia leaned over to get a better look, her shoulder brushing against his. "This could bring down the whole platform if we don't fix it fast. Have you isolated the affected nodes?"
The brief contact of their shoulders sent a shiver through Juno, his heart jumping before he pushed the feeling aside, focusing on the task at hand. He nodded, regaining his poise. "Yeah, I have," he confirmed, gesturing to a couple of screens. "The nodes appear to be overloaded. I'm trying to identify the source of the issue. It seems like there's some kind of unexpected bandwidth usage."
Venetia couldn't help but notice how focused he was. For someone who often seemed nervous or unsure, he was remarkably composed under pressure. "Here," she said, pointing to the screen. "Check that script. It might be where the scaling issue originated." "Can you patch it?" she softly asked, not wanting to place too much pressure on an already stressful situation.
Juno nodded, his fingers flying over the keyboard as he made the necessary adjustments. The tension was evident in the way he moved, but there was also a deep focus, a sort of determination in his eyes. "I can," he replied, glancing at her for a moment. "But it's going to take a bit of time. Need to make sure I fix everything thoroughly." The pressure of the situation was clearly weighing on him, but his ability to maintain his composure was admirable, especially under her gaze.
For the next hour they worked in tandem, their movements almost synchronized. Venetia handled the broader system reconfiguration while Juno focused on rewriting the faulty script and restarting the affected servers. Despite the high stakes, their collaboration was seamless, each anticipating the other's needs without words. Finally, Venetia checked the dashboard and nodded in satisfaction. "The servers are stabilizing. Traffic is balancing out again."
Juno leaned back in his chair, releasing a long exhale filled with exhaustion and relief. He ran a hand through his hair, the pressure and anxiety of the past hour slowly releasing its grip on him. "That should do it," he said, looking over the monitors and screens that had once flashed with warnings. "The servers are back to normal." He looked at her then, a mixture of gratefulness and awe in his eyes. "Thanks for your help. I couldn't have figured it out so quickly without you."
Venetia shook her head, her expression softening. "Don't sell yourself short, Juno. You stayed calm under pressure and figured out the solution. Good work. You handled that like a pro."
Juno's eyes widened slightly, surprise and a small, shy smile on his face. Her praise was as sincere as it was uncommon, making warmth spread in his chest. He wasn't used to being lauded like that, especially by her. "Thanks," he said, his voice a murmur. "I don't feel like it most of the time," he added, a hint of his usual vulnerability slipping through. He quickly looked away, a hint of pink on his cheeks as he fiddled with the console, trying to look busy.
As the adrenaline began to fade, the room seemed to grow quieter. Venetia stepped closer, resting a hand lightly on Juno's shoulder, a fleeting gesture of reassurance and gratitude. "You should be proud of yourself. I know I am."
The touch of her hand, light as it was, sent a shiver through Juno, his breath hitching. He looked up at her, their closeness making his heart race. Her words, so sincere and unexpected, held so much weight. He swallowed hard as he tried to speak, his voice a little uneven. "That means a lot, especially from you."
Their gazes lingered for a moment longer than necessary, the tension in the air shifting into something more charged. Venetia felt a flutter of something unfamiliar, admiration mixed with curiosity. She let her hand fall away, clearing her throat as she stepped back. "Well," she said, her tone returning to its usual professionalism, though softer than before, "we make a good team."
Juno mirrored her movement, his heart still racing as they put some distance between them. He tried to steady his voice, pushing away the feelings that swirled inside him. "We do," he agreed, trying to match her cool and professional tone. He gave her a small, shy smile, the look they had shared replaying over and over in his mind. No one had ever looked at him the way she did, had ever praised him the way she had, and it was doing something to him.
As they packed up to leave for the night, both of them felt the weight of the evening's events lingering. Not just the crisis they had resolved, but the growing sense of connection that neither could quite put into words. The accidental touches, the lingering glances, they were starting to mean something, and neither Venetia nor Juno could ignore it anymore.
The walk to the parking lot was quiet, the air around them heavy with unspoken words. Juno walked slightly behind her, his hands shoved in his pockets. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, but it was filled with a sort of nervous anticipation. They'd worked together in intense situations before, but this felt different, heavier, more intimate. As they reached Venetia's Mercedes, Juno awkwardly cleared his throat. He started, suddenly at a loss for words.
Feeling the intimate tension, Venetia interrupted him, setting a boundary. "Well, good night, Juno. I'll see you tomorrow." She unlocked her car.
Juno's heart sank slightly as she spoke, breaking the silence. He tried to push away the disappointment and the wave of rejection that washed over him. He nodded, feigning nonchalance. Yeah, good night," he replied, shoving his hands further into his pockets. I'll see you tomorrow." He forced a small smile, even as he felt a pang of hurt. As Venetia drove out of the parking lot, Juno lingered, watching her car disappear. The silence of the night enveloped him, his mind replaying the evening's events. The way they had worked together in perfect sync, the intensity of their shared focus, the small touches and looks, it all felt so different from their usual interactions. Juno exhaled deeply, the cool night air doing little to ease his jumbled thoughts. He had sensed something between them, a spark and connection that transcended their professional relationship, but maybe he had been mistaken. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Also, feel free to visit my Patreon for more content.